Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our practice night and our continuing series exploring Metta. And this evening we have a real treat for you. So I'm delighted that we've been joined by Padmavajra from the Padmaloka Shrine Room. And I'll say something about Padmavajra shortly by way of an introduction. But first, I'm just going to run through how the evening's going to pan out. So after my introduction of Padmavajra, he'll be speaking to us up until our break, which will be around about 8 o'clock. We'll have the usual tea break for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back for discussion groups. And this evening, because it's a full moon, a wolf moon, no less, we'll be celebrating this with a puja, which Harsharatna will be leading, which will finish around about 9. And it's great to have another visitor from one of our retreat centres after Chandra Prabha from Sthiranāga joined us last week. And I wanted to make a similar appeal. And in thanking you in advance for your wonderful generosity, suggest that this evening you consider making a donation to the Padmaloka Retreat Centre instead of to the Colchester Centre, as many of you would normally do. Our retreat centres have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic, so I'll be putting a link in the chat box at the end of the evening, and also include that in the post-class email, which will have a link in it to Padmavajra's recording that will go out after the class. In June last year, I was due to be co-leading one of the Great Gathering retreats for men at Padmaloka with Dharma Shalin, who interestingly came along as a newcomer to the Colchester Buddhist Centre many years ago. And one of the things I was really looking forward to was having the honour and privilege of introducing Padmavajra as our main speaker for the weekend. So to have this opportunity, albeit in very different circumstances, is quite a moment for me, because Padmavajra has had a significant influence on the direction of my life, as well as being a huge inspiration for me over many years. So some of you will know that Padmavajra first encountered the Dharma at the Brighton Buddhist Centre, I think at the age of 17. He was ordained 2 years later, aged just 19. And he spent a number of years living in India, supporting the pioneering work that Lokamitra was doing to establish our movement in India. And he moved to Padmaloka in 1990 to join the ordination team, who helped prepare men for ordination. So he's a private preceptor. He's ordained many men. And he's also a public preceptor of even more men, including our very own Akasha Hridaya, who he ordained at Padmaloka back in October. A wonderful occasion that some of you may have watched live on YouTube. So many of you will also be familiar with Padmavajra from his talks. I had a little look, and there are currently 291 of these on free Buddhist audio, not to mention a large number of videos now on YouTube, which you can get access to from the Padmaloka YouTube channel, many of which he's given since the first lockdown back in March last year. And it's very easy, I think, to experience Padmavajra's Vajra quality, the diamond thunderbolt cutting through delusion, and quite frankly, not messing about in delivering a dharmic message. And I have to say, for a number of years that I attended ordination training retreats at Padmaloka, I was fairly nervous, not to say terrified, of Padmavajra. And I remember coming back from retreats, and the order members in Colchester, lovely men that many of you will know, like Sri Kirti, Shantivajra, Sthiranāga, Amalakati, would say, "Have you spoken to Padmavajra yet? Have you been for a walk with Padmavajra yet?" And I can honestly say that my answer would always be, "You're joking, aren't you?" And I just couldn't imagine why this spiritual giant would have any interest in me. And I think my fear reached its peak, and at the same time turned a corner whilst I was washing up in the pot wash room at Padmaloka on another large retreat. I remember washing up with my marigolds on, and I was handling mugs using these slippery gloves and moving them across the kitchen. And as was the case in those days, I was probably going too fast and not being mindful enough. And I had picked up these mugs, and one of them just slipped out of my hand and smashed into dozens of pieces on the floor, just as Padmavajra walked through the kitchen. And I remember I just froze and just stared in terror. And he didn't break stride. And he just had this massive smile on his face. And as he walked through to the kitchen, he just shouted, "Rock and roll," and gave this huge chuckle. And that just broke something for me, I guess, so that when I was invited to visit him in his room, when I was later on in the process, that's when I truly saw the Padma, the lotus aspect of Padmavajra, the kindness, the warmth, the love, and the just deep care, concern, and interest in me. And this comes from Padmavajra's wonderful practice of metta. So when Harsharatna and I were considering who we might invite as guests to this series on metta, Padmavajra was right at the very top of my list. So it's with enormous personal pleasure that I invite Padmavajra to speak with us this evening.
Just let them settle down here. So, brothers and sisters in the Dharma, first of all, a big thank you to Sthiranāga for that really wonderful, very, very generous introduction. There's a lot to live up to now. I mean, it's lovely having wonderful introductions, and I feel, you know, it might be better if I just sort of said, "Oh, sorry, I don't feel very well, I can't give the talk," and then you're just left with this wonderful impression of me from Sthiranāga. I'm really very, very glad to be talking to you at those in the, well, I was going to say at the Colchester Buddhist Centre, and I suppose it is at the Colchester Buddhist Centre. It's the Colchester Buddhist Sangha, or quite a few of you in the Colchester Buddhist Sangha. I was delighted when Sthiranāga invited me to speak. I've got a long-standing connection with Sthiranāga and many others in Colchester. So, although I haven't been for a proper visit, which I will rectify, you've heard it here. You know, you can invite me down when we can do that sort of thing. It's something missing from my Sthiranāga education, that I haven't been to the Colchester Centre for a long time. And I'm really delighted to be talking about metta. I think it's quite a long time since I was asked to give a talk about metta. I was writing to somebody today and I said, well, there's nothing better than being able to give a talk about metta. And I said, oh, actually there is. What's better is actually practicing it and living it. But I'm quite good at talking. I was sort of well known for my talking, and talking is easier than doing in my case. So perhaps there is nothing better than talking about metta. And if you've been involved in Triratna for a long time, and I can see some pretty hefty order members there, long-standing order members who know the Mettā Bhavana very, very well. In a way, there's probably, you know, not much more perhaps to learn about metta. You've probably had many talks, heard many talks on metta. You do the Mettā Bhavana, the development of loving kindness meditation regularly. There's so much available in Triratna. What more can one possibly say about Mettā Bhavana? And although I do want to, hopefully, well, we'll see where we go, sort of maybe give you a few tips for the actual practice of Mettā Bhavana meditation. I want to begin in a slightly different way, with a different theme. It's really asking the question, why do we practice the Mettā Bhavana? Why do we do this meditation? Why is it there? Why is it so central to Sthiranāga practice? You know, it is the main, in our system of meditation practices, mindfulness of breathing is to develop integration. Mettā Bhavana is there to develop particularly positive emotion. So it's really central to our system of meditation. But of course, it's there. It's an important practice, and perhaps that you just have to say that's why it's so important. I can remember when Bhante, gave that lecture, A System of Meditation. It was on an order convention in 1978. I'd been ordained a couple of years, and it was a revelation, because we had all these different practices: the mindfulness of breathing, the Mettā Bhavana, contemplation of the 6 elements, and of course our visualization practices. If we were order members, we had also the just sitting practice, but in a way it wasn't clear how they fitted together. So that talk was really important, and it's well worth going back to, because it's so fresh, so alive. In recent years, there's been lots and lots of commentaries on the system of practice. I've done them myself, which, adds even more, and it gets even more elaborate. Go back to the source. Go back to the source, because I can remember very well when he talked about metta and the stage of positive emotion, his language was really strong. He made the point that positive emotion is so important in Dharma life, because it's our emotions that move us. We are not sustained by abstract ideas. There's a big theme in Bhante's teaching, that we are desiderative beings. We are creatures of desire. We are creatures of emotion. Yes, ideas, good ideas, right view, mindfulness, that whole realm, if you like, those different realms, so important, absolutely. But unless there's emotions engaged in our Dharma life, we're not going to get anywhere. That famous quotation of many years ago, very early on in Bhante's life, the central issue for most people, by which I think he means all people, in the spiritual life is to find emotional equivalence to intellectual understanding. Emotional equivalence to intellectual understanding. We know that we should practice the precepts. We know that we need to do this and do that and do the other. We know it from back to front and inside out. But do we do it consistently? There's often a lag, because our emotions are not engaged. So in that lecture, A System of Meditation, he was saying that our positive emotion should be really strong, really hot. Metta is a hot emotion. And the other Brahma-viharas, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity, they're strong emotions, but without any self-interest, without any grasping and attachment. And in another place, he says it's very hard for us to imagine an emotion that's really strong, that is without self-interest. Very hard for us to imagine such an emotion. So don't be surprised if you find, even after many years, the Mettā Bhavana not that easy, because we're actually calling into being. Bhavana means to make, to become. We're calling into being a very, very rare emotion of tremendous strength and intensity and all-pervading, boundless, which is very strong and yet deeply peaceful, deeply calm at its heart. It's very, very attractive emotion. I think this is important as well. I think it's very important to, before you do any Mettā Bhavana practice, to contemplate the beauty of metta. The beauty of metta. Really get fascinated with the quality of metta. If you like, even bring to mind the Buddha or a bodhisattva that particularly, or a person who particularly embodies metta for you. Really bring them to mind and try to imagine that very strong emotion, which is profoundly peaceful at its heart. I remember him also saying in that lecture that positive emotion is the lifeblood of the order, of what we used to call the Western Buddhist order. And he'd probably go further, the lifeblood of our movement, the lifeblood of any Sangha around a center. It's positive emotions, the emotions of friendliness, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity, faith, devotion, generosity of spirit. This is the lifeblood. And we know very well if, a being, any living being, it ceases to be if the lifeblood isn't there and the lifeblood isn't circulating. So it's so important that we develop metta. But I want to take that a bit further. Why do we do the Mettā Bhavana? Of course, we could think, well, it's really important. It's part of the path. It leads us to enlightenment. It leads to our growth. All very well, but in a sense, that is superficial. That's not quite right, even though it's true. We've got to go deeper. We've got to go much deeper. It's to do with the fact that the need for love in the fullest sense, in the sense of metta, it runs very, very deep. The need for love. It's a deep need for us as human beings, as living beings. In a way, love, metta, whenever I use the word love, I mean it in the sense of metta. I think love just has such a strength to it, so that's why I'm using it. Without it, there isn't any real human society without love, not really. No real sustainable human society. Without it, it's actually very, very difficult to be a human being. Leaving aside things like enlightenment and progressing along the path, unless there is love, it's very, very hard to be a truly human being. Because human beings are profoundly social. We're profoundly social beings. There's this weird world in which we live where, unfortunately, it's very easy for human beings to feel very, very isolated from one another, particularly perhaps at this time, and perhaps even different theories of society, different political theories, where this sense of isolation, of individualism becomes rampant, becomes so strong. But that distorts what human beings really are. My firm belief is that, if you like, to be a real human being, a true human being, the deepest kind of human being, you need to be always in a state of loving kindness, which will lead you to a sense of profound solidarity with all other human beings. And of course, in the Buddhist context, with all of life itself. So metta, the meaning of doing the Mettā Bhavana is to achieve this, is to achieve, if you like, this sense of complete, solidarity, interconnectedness, if you like, profound identification with all human beings, especially, but all of life. That's the nature of, that's what we're doing in the Mettā Bhavana. That's what we should really be concerned with achieving in that practice and bringing that practice into our life. It reminds me when I talk like this, and actually the origin of this way of thinking comes from Sangharakshita, comes from Bhante, it comes from his discussion of the first precept in the 10 pillars of Buddhism, which describes the 10 precepts that we take at ordination and that we're supposed to practice. His discussion of the first precept is so profound. It's so deep. He talks about the golden rule. The golden rule, this is an idea I think goes back to Aristotle, but it goes further back than that, which is treating others as you would treat yourself. Doing unto others as you do unto yourself. extending the care and concern and consideration that you have for yourself, for others, for all others. So there's this sense that you don't think of yourself as a separate being. You regard yourself as profoundly connected with all of life. And he really goes into that. He goes into that very, very fully and thoroughly, arriving at a discussion of presenting Shantideva's great meditation. Shantideva the Great, 8th century Bodhisattva, the composer of the Bodhicharyavatara. His discussion of the perfection of meditation, Dhyana Paramita, is a discussion of the realization of the sameness of self and other. I'll have probably something more to say about this a bit later. This sense that the real perfection of meditation is realizing non-separateness, that you're profoundly the same as others, in the same way that you protect yourself from harm, in the same way that you want the very, very best for yourself. Others are exactly the same. You don't need any information about them whatsoever to know that for them, their life is dear to them. Their life is dear to them. They want to feel cared for and protected. They wish to be happy. They wish to be free of suffering. So why not thinking of oneself as so special? What is so special about me? A recurring phrase in Shantideva's text. What is so special about me that I just look after myself and not look after others and all others? That's his idea of the perfection of meditation. He goes even further and talks about the exchange of self and other, the imaginative exchange of, as it were, imagining your consciousness as another's, sort of imaginatively going out of yourself and inhabiting the other, so that you have a sense of how they feel, how they think, how they see the world. So you're developing this profound, well, it's more than empathy. The Sangharakshita calls it an imaginative identification with all others, so that there's an even deeper sense of how to care for them, how to work for them. So this is the deep meaning of doing Mettā Bhavana. This is the real reason why we do it. To think of it in a sense as a practice is to actually reduce it in a way that's a bit too self-centered. Mettā Bhavana is an enactment. It's an enactment, it's an action. It's an enactment of a particular kind of realization of the sameness of others, the sameness of self and others. That's what we're really doing in Mettā Bhavana meditation. The word bhavana, interestingly enough, can mean literally to make, to become, to bring into being, but it can also mean imagination. It can mean that you're imagining in this practice to develop this loving kindness. So I was very, very struck when Sangharakshita taught like this, and he even ended up quoting William Blake as saying, you know, the greatest, the most sacred act, the most holy act is to place another before you, is to put another before you. That's the most holy thing that you can do, that you have a full realization of the other, the vividness of the other person, of the other being. They're as vivid to you as you are to yourself, even more vivid perhaps, so that you really respond to their need, to their aspiration, to their deep longings, if you like. Then there's Dr. Ambedkar, Babasaheb Ambedkar, the great leader of the Dalit communities in India, who converted to Buddhism in 1956. And as Sthiranāga said, I had many years in India, so I studied Dr. Ambedkar's life and work. And in his magnum opus, The Buddha and His Dhamma, there's an incredible discussion of Dhamma and morality. And I remember Bhante saying in Ambedkar and Buddhism that he thinks in this section you have Ambedkar's deepest thinking. Because what he says is this, he says that in other religions, morality is detachable. It depends whether or not God is happy for morality to be practiced or not. But he said in Buddhism, it's not like that. Morality is absolutely central. He even comes up with a famous phrase, which, you know, you always repeat in a talk in India. Dhamma is morality, morality is Dhamma. And this morality, he says, is sacred and universal. It's the most holy thing, and it's for all occasions, it's for all people. There's nobody to be left out from this. And this morality is the morality that arises from the direct necessity of treating every single man and woman with respect, with metta, and to respond to their need. You can see how much it goes against caste and things like that. Every single person in that sense is to be treated in exactly the same way, with metta, with respect, and this is sacred and universal. It's the most holy thing. You know, when I used to give talks in India, I'd say, you know, it's not, you know, it's holier than going to Bodh Gaya. It's holier than going on pilgrimage, you know, to treat every single person, every single being with real loving respect. And this replaces God in Buddhism. You know, if you're still keen on God, if you fancy that, this is it. It's this morality, it's this life, it's metta. That's the most sacred thing. So what I'm trying to get at when we do the Mettā Bhavana, because I do know that sometimes people struggle with the metta, and I think it can sometimes be because perhaps they're treating the metta too personally, in a sense. It's too much to do with, in a way, the narrow confines of their own mind and consciousness. Well, in a way, that's making it all a bit personal. What we're trying to sort of invoke, if you like, is this quality. Well, more, it's a force, actually, this force of loving kindness, which creates and underpins a genuinely human world. That's what we're concerned to be doing when we do the Mettā Bhavana. In the Karaniya Metta Sutta, that great sutta that Bhante's done a great commentary on, towards the end, you get this famous line, standing or moving, sitting, lying down, whatever you are doing, be free of laziness and wield this mindfulness of boundless love. For this is what the wise call abiding in the divine. Wield this mindfulness of boundless love. The word for wield is aditeya, which is a bit like the word adhisthana. It has this sense that your metta has become a sort of magical force. That it's not so much that you're thinking about doing metta or even doing an emotion called metta. It's much more that there's this benign force that's sort of moving through you and which is meeting whatever you arise and having a magical effect, having a magically transforming effect on the world around you. This is abiding in the divine. This is the Brahma Vihara of metta. So when we sit down to do the Mettā Bhavana, it's good, I think, to be mindful of all this, to be mindful of this direction. And, you know, we teach it in this 5-stage form. In recent years, people have been saying, no. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha just talks about radiating it out to others. This is a sort of later development. I don't do it like that. I think you have to be a bit careful with all that, because one of the things it's very easy to do in the Mettā Bhavana, you sometimes notice it in you know, when I used to do beginners classes, you know, regulars classes, you know, we'd have a quick look around the room, see how people are getting on. And you noticed in the early stages, the first 4 stages, you see they're a bit, you know, they're obviously, it's not, if they're not falling asleep, it's not entirely going well. Last stage, you know, these lovely smiles, you know, loving the world, you know, I love you all. I love humanity, and you know, getting off on all that. And in a way, that's easy. That's an abstraction. That's loving an abstraction. I mean, I love the stages of the metta because they keep me really honest, if you like, because what you're doing in those stages, those early stages of the Mettā Bhavana practice, they call it traditionally, you're breaking down the barriers to your boundless love. And you're really being honest about what you really feel about people, what you really feel about yourself, what you really feel about the good friend, that there are people you're indifferent to. And yes, there are people you don't like. You even hate them. You know, come on. You know, there's resentment, anger, whatever you want to call it, or, you know, you're going through a bad patch. But it's so important to really own these emotions. I think it's a brilliantly designed meditation, just so long as you're realizing that these are preparatory. They're kind of purifying, if you like, our responses so that we can really open up to metta in the fullest sense of the word, in the way I've been describing it at the beginning. So let's have a look again at those stages. Let's see if there's, you know, maybe a little bit of new light that we can sort of shed, you know, on these stages. The first stage, I know some people find the most difficult of all for some reason. I can't say I've ever had a problem with the first stage. I don't know if that's because I'm just a rampant egotist. I enjoy the first stage. You know, I really enjoy, you know, developing love for myself. I mean, quite honestly, I'd quite like not to leave the first stage because, you know, I just really enjoy it. I mean, it's a terrible thing to admit, isn't it? And I am English after all. But, you know, perhaps there's something in the way I'm talking. It doesn't mean I'm good at the Mettā Bhavana, by the way. That doesn't make me it just means that, you know, I'm probably a bit narcissistic. But that's not metta for oneself either. But anyway, off of me. Let's look at the first stage. I think one of the things that's really, there are all sorts of things you can use, I think, to get yourself going in the first stage. I think, first of all, in a way, not getting yourself going, just simply sitting there and enjoying being alive. You know, sometimes we can have all sorts of troubles and problems and maybe even, you know, bad views of ourselves and all the rest of it. But hey, you're sitting there, you're breathing, you're sensing, you know, you can hear, you can see, you can touch. You have this thing, this wonderful mind, this wonderful consciousness, this wonderfully aware consciousness, a wonderful thing, the human mind. Because we're actually able to work with it. You know, it's this self-reflective mind. That means that we're not trapped in whatever state we're in. Is what, when in the Tibetan tradition especially, they talk about realizing that you have a precious human existence. What they're trying to get at is that you're not just humanoid, you also have this consciousness that is able to reflect, that is able to, you know, practice ethics. It can put a gap between you and your reactions to things. It's a consciousness that can even sort of step outside of itself and even imagine developing loving kindness. That's a wonderful thing. And we have it. We have it. You know, we don't have to do anything to recognize that we have that. We just need to recognize that we have it. This human existence is extraordinary, very precious. We don't know how long we've got it. So I think it's important that we start in that basic kind of way. I also think there's another thing that can happen with the first stage. It can sound like a funny way of talking, and maybe even it might even seem a bit alienated, but I've been noticing it within myself. Almost there's another Padmavajra who's sort of about there. And that Padmavajra is incredibly benign and really sort of cares about this one who's maybe going through it a bit at the moment. And like a sort of, you know, a higher friend, if you like, that is really benign. and really cares about what I get up to. Maybe it's my emerging conscience. I don't know what you call it. Maybe it's a little guardian angel that sort of appeared, or a guardian deva or something like that. I know this might sound a bit odd to you, but I've just noticed it. It's not something I've contrived, but I thought, well, maybe there's something in that. Maybe you need to sort of try and identify with a different part of yourself that is incredibly loving. There is a kind of deity of loving kindness, almost like a sort of inner guide that says, come on, you're all right. You know, it's okay. I know friends of mine, I'm quite shocked when they tell me this. People I'm kind of Kalyana Mitra to, preceptor to, they say that they often bring me to mind and they hear my voice encouraging them. I mean, presumably they've had an experience of me encouraging them. But of course, in a sense, that's them. It's me, it's sort of their memory of me, if you like, is really themselves at their best, which is sort of, as it were, projected onto me. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of projection, because sometimes it's hard for us in our subjectivity to see those better aspects of ourselves, to see those higher aspects of ourselves. So maybe you could experiment with that. If inside yourself you can't feel good about yourself, well, that's okay. Just identify with that other self, if you like, which is like a friend to you, keeping an eye on you, beaming Metta to you. He's always slightly behind me. It seems to come through my back for some reason. I don't quite know why it does that. That's but some sense that somebody's got my back, if you like. I think also when we talk about the first stage, sometimes people just sit there and they feel bad. And you've really got to check out why you feel bad. Now, ask yourself, have I been really unskillful today? Have I spoken harshly to someone? Have I wasted my time doing, fruitless things? And if you have, then it's a good idea to bring that to mind, even to confess it to the shrine. And, so really honestly own that. In a way, as it were, purge yourself of that so that you really let it go. If you have a look and you think, well, no, actually, I haven't done anything, when that feeling of being bad is irrational. I know some people really suffer from this, a sort of irrational guilt. They've just got into a sort of bad habit of feeling bad. And you've really got to work against that. You've really got to think against that and really look at the good that you've done. The Buddha says that there's a particular version of the spiral path where it begins with clear conscience, having nothing to reproach yourself as regards to your morals. And it's really important to own that, really important to recognize your goodness. And out of goodness develops joy. Out of goodness develops the other stages of the path. And really, really dwell on that. And that's, in a way, the first stage of the metta. Done, dealt with, if you like. Really dwelling on the goodness that's there. Don't be afraid. Don't sort of think, oh, will I be egotistical? The Buddha didn't think that was a problem. Not at all. Recognizing the good you do and the good you've done is so important for spiritual development. So that's a few thoughts on the first stage. Yes, I haven't said anything about the phrases you can use, but you can use them. You can use those contemplations. May I be well, may I be happy. The texts are much more specific. It's more like, may I be happy-minded. May I be happy-selved. May I, they even use the word kema, beautiful word, meaning secure, meaning peace. It's actually a synonym for enlightenment. May I have the ultimate security of Buddhahood. So find phrases that have real meaning. There's nothing wrong with the phrases, providing they're said with a real intention, a real heart aspiration. Nothing wrong with the phrases at all. They're like a mantra, generating a particular quality. So the second stage is in many ways the easiest, perhaps, because you're bringing to mind a friend. I mean, sometimes if I'm having trouble in the first stage, I just go straight to the second. Because I know that in the second, if I think of my friend, and I'm blessed with many friends, there will be love. It will just be there. And if I'm loving, I'm happy. You shouldn't be dogmatic about the first stage, by the way. Well, unless I've got the first stage sorted, I can't do the second stage. You know, I remember somebody telling me they did 50 minutes of self-metta and felt miserable at the end. I thought, well, of course you're going to feel miserable at the end. If you're just thinking about yourself for 50 minutes, you're not going to deal with it that way. You know, you can't separate yourself out from others. Like I said, we're profoundly relational. And I know when you know, as you know, one of Milton's angels says in the Garden of Eden, where there is love, there is happiness. Where there is love, there is happiness. So yeah, bring to mind your good friend. Maybe do the first stage after the second stage. You know, because you'll be feeling really good. You'll be feeling really expansive. And, you know, it's this thing, it's a good friend where it's a very straightforward, friendly, emotional response. Very clean, very pure, no sort of excessive attachment or anything like that. You really do love this person for themselves. And you just bask in that. You just completely give yourself to that. It's really important in the different traditions of Mettā Bhavana meditation. They talk about, you know, in the early stages, you're really trying to be absorbed in metta. They even use the word samadhi, complete absorption in loving kindness. They often say in the traditional text, you would typically, they do sort of 6-stage metta, and the second stage is to your teacher, your Kalyana Mitra, because they seem to think that you'll very, very naturally become absorbed in metta if you bring such a person to mind. So the second stage, you know, in the way we usually teach it, you're looking for absorption. It's completely natural absorption in loving kindness for your friend, and you really feel that your consciousness is expanding. I remember Bhante saying that metta is an ecstatic emotion. It's ecstatic. He meant it in the, yes, it's very blissful when you really get into metta, but he was also thinking of the meaning of it, of ecstatic, in the sense of standing outside of yourself, ecstasis. And you can really feel that, I think, in the second stage. You stand outside of yourself. You really expand to embrace your good friend. And that is a very, very lovely feeling. That there's a real connection, I think, that's the connection, if you like, between metta and happiness, between ethics and happiness. Because when you're doing that, you're standing outside of yourself. And when you stand outside of yourself, you feel happy. When you expand in that way. You know, we know, don't we, that when we're unhappy, we're tight. Our consciousness, even our body tightens. So you expand and you dwell in that for as long as you can, actually. And it's very important if you're struggling in the later stages to go back to the stages where you are absorbed again in the metta. You know, so you're moving from the absorption in metta out to more challenging subjects. And, you know, it's so important, I think, Mettā Bhavana for friends. It means you don't take friends for granted. And I feel with my own Mettā Bhavana that the Mettā Bhavana itself is not a preparation for the day. It is a mental action. It's a karmic force that's actually affecting people. And, you know, I've had the experience of people doing metta for me, miles and miles, hundreds, thousands of miles away. And I know they're doing it for me. I've even checked it out. And we can really affect people very, very positively in the metta practice. It's a real incentive for me to do the metta, thinking that the actual practice is a sort of magic right to affect the world around. And then, of course, there's the third stage, which some people in some ways find the most difficult, because you don't particularly like them, you don't particularly dislike them. The acquaintance, the person you see regularly. I'm sure you've heard all this in countless classes. The postman, the shopkeeper, the Amazon delivery drivers. There's a lot of them who come here. Shouldn't have said that, should I? The farmer down the road, the neighbours, and you know, all the rest of it. No particular feeling either way. I often mention when I talk about this is the customer. I used to work in the Croydon Centre years ago. We had a very successful restaurant, vegetarian restaurant, and there was this man who came in regularly called the customer. He worked in one of the local offices. He wore a suit, very, very properly dressed. He always had quiche and salad and soup in our successful vegetarian restaurant. And he got so much metta from us because he was our third stage person. Because there was kind of, you know, he was so sort of anonymous. So, you know, all of us were doing metta, unbeknown to each other. We were all doing metta for this man. And we then one day he didn't come in, and somebody asked somebody who they knew worked in the same office as him. They said, oh, he's had a heart attack. And we were really upset, and we sent him flowers and, you know, a card of well-wishing. We'd really developed some feeling for him. And, you know, and his colleague told us that he was so moved by that, and, you know, went round the office showing his card when he'd got better, showing the card and the flowers. I'd never know what happened to him because I left Croydon, but it sort of struck me that he wouldn't be somebody I would naturally feel any sort of feeling for. But that's what metta does. Metta humanizes. You know, because a lot of the time, I think, in relation to people, that it's so easy, you know, especially when we see people regularly, they become sort of more like things rather than people. We don't like to admit that, but they're kind of just passing us on the edge of our consciousness. I think metta humanizes, you know, the world around us. You see everybody more as really living beings. And I think in this stage, I think those reflections that I mentioned from Shantideva are particularly valuable. That okay, I don't know anything about them. I don't know anything about their life. You know, I see them regularly. But what I do know is that they are living. I can be pretty sure that, like me, they want to be happy. They want to avoid suffering. I'm sure they want to be looked after. They want to feel protected. They want to feel safe. I'm sure of that because I do. I want to feel safe. I want to be treated courteously. You can be sure that that's what they want. So you do those reflections to really try and develop that sense of connection with them, and remove that sense of indifference, that sense of just somebody on the edge of consciousness, that they are alive, and this is where metta is so magical. I mean, I've had the experience so many times of doing metta to an acquaintance that I see maybe around the village, and sure enough, I end up in a conversation with them. Obviously, these days, socially distanced. You know, but we end up having a talk and, you know, hearing more about them and so on, and, you know, realizing that this is actually, you know, a very interesting person. You know, and you know, you get a sense of how they see the world around them. So then the fourth stage, you know, hopefully Bhante feels he could never understand why people found the Mettā Bhavana difficult, because he thought it was a wonderfully kind of rolling, accumulating practice with a real sort of momentum to it. I do think it's important, like I've said, in the stages, throughout the practice, to keep moving back to the sort of absorption in metta. Don't get metta fatigue by, you know, just going from one person to the other. Keep dipping back into the sort of reservoir of metta that's there. And the fourth stage, of course, can be very challenging. I quite like the fourth stage on a good day, because there are certain days with the fourth stage when I really like the challenge. I really like the challenge. I know this is, and in a sense, this is where metta is getting real, because you're really kind of challenging that aversion and that, that stance that you have in relation to that person. And sometimes people say, well, I don't hate anybody. I don't dislike anybody. I mean, it's worth, a friend of mine, Lokamitra, a very good friend of mine, he used to say when he was asked that, have you tried looking inside the family? And there would be this sort of shocked look on people's faces, because of course there was somebody in their family they really didn't like, but they didn't think they were included for some reason in the, in the metta practice. But so that's an interesting one. It could be a hate figure in the world. There seem to be no shortage of them these days in politics and all the rest of it. Yes, they deserve our loving kindness. They need our loving kindness. We can't just keep them as a convenient kind of object of our negativity. That won't do. We've got to extend loving kindness to our favourite baddies. Again, it's really important, I think, that you keep dipping back into that absorption in metta, and really again sort of look to really try to reflect, well, they are actually a human being like I am. There might be something in you that really resists that thought, but you've got to challenge that. No, they are human. They might be going about it in a weird way, but they are actually trying to be happy. They are actually trying to be secure. They are actually trying to live in a way that makes them feel okay. I mean, you don't agree with it, you don't have to approve of it, but they are, in that sense, the same as you, exactly the same as you. Really work on that. I think also it's worth reflecting that in the tradition, there's all sorts of reflections they give for removing hatred. Like, for example, that, that there is no justification for hatred in Buddhist practice. Here in this world, hatred never ceases through hatred. It only ceases through love. This is the eternal law. Dhammapada, verse 6, is it verse 5, I think. There's absolutely no justification for hatred and anger and resentment. You can dress it up however you like, but it has no place in a Buddhist practitioner. And the extent to which it's dominating your life, to that extent you are blocked from further development. You've really got to overcome that. You've really got to transform that. I had a little breakthrough with the fourth stage on a solitary retreat some years ago, and I was really helped in this from reading Bhante's Living with Kindness. And he was talking about the fourth stage, and I'd got into a sort of, basically I realized through reading a particular passage in there that I was annoyed at the people that I was putting in the fourth stage. I was annoyed with them because they were them. And because I was going through their different faults, and actually I realized, are they faults actually, or is it's just kind of the way they are? Because actually they've never really harmed me. I just don't like the way they talk. I don't like the way they walk. I don't like their vibe. But actually, that says more about me than them. And, Bhante made the point that you're not doing the Mettā Bhavana in the fourth stage, even to sort of change hatred into love. That's too self-centered. You're not doing it for yourself. You've got to just move into that thing. No, you're doing it for them. You're developing loving kindness for them. It's irrelevant what they're like. They're just another person. And I found that incredibly liberating. And I could, in these cases, these people, I could sort of think, well, actually, I started to see, well, from another point of view, the things I don't like in them actually are qualities. They're not my favorite qualities, but they are qualities that they have. So in whatever way, you really work on eroding, that hatred. You really work on overthrowing it. And of course, it's very important with metta practice to realize that, to be patient, to practice, Kshanti Paramita comes into Mettā Bhavana. I see Mettā Bhavana as very much a slow dawn. It's a slow dawning. It's not a great sort of flash of lightning. It's a much slower, gentle emergence in our lives. It really takes time. Yeah, you can have incredible breakthroughs in it, but it's that slow dawning. And of course, in the last stage, which in a way I probably already talked about at the beginning, you're expanding in all kinds of directions and bringing to mind all kinds of people and beings. And in a way, we could wax lyrical about all that, but it is a very important stage. And no matter how you sort of struggled in the earlier stages, it's really, really important to have a sense of expansion. Metta is a boundless state. It's an apamanya, as it's called. There's no end to metta. Metta is endless, because there's no end to beings. And it's very important to start having a feeling for boundless consciousness, a boundless heart, the metta citta. The heart that doesn't actually have any boundary. And of course, when you start talking like this, you're sort of opening up to real wisdom. Sometimes people like to present metta as a sort of elementary practice. Well, it's not, it's a wisdom practice. Real metta is the experience of seeing through, the real seeing through of self and other. And all others. So in that sense, it's a wisdom practice. That's what you're doing. Actually, in every stage of the practice, that's what you're doing. And you never leave the Mettā Bhavana behind. It just gets better and deeper. And when you really see through, the metta then becomes spontaneous and natural. And you don't even have to think about doing it. The Buddha didn't think about doing metta. The Buddha's natural state of being was deeds of loving kindness in body, speech, and mind, in everything that he did, in everything that he was. His mindfulness was metta, his metta was mindfulness, and you can see that on display in so many stories in the Pali Canon, this tremendous sort of awareness of others. At the end, in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, he says to Ananda about the different assemblies that he could enter. And he mentioned, different human assemblies, human gatherings of different communities, monks and so on. But he also mentioned different god realms. He said, Ananda, I can go into these realms, I can wear their clothes, and I can talk their language. And they wonder, who is this person who is wearing our clothes, who is speaking our language? And then I vanish. And they say, who was that person who was wearing our clothes and who was speaking those words to us? And I think what the Buddha is really describing here is tremendous powers of empathy that comes from loving kindness, so that he could really attune to every single individual. It said of the Buddha's teachings that he could talk to a huge number of people, but everybody felt spoken to individually. This all comes from transcendental loving kindness, transcendental metta. And finally, and I'm over time, we must make the connection between metta and beauty. This is something that Bhante's really made a lot of, that, and you can even try this in your Mettā Bhavana practice, that when you come to the end of your towards the end of your metta practice, Your metta, he says, should become sort of free-floating. It doesn't have a center, and it doesn't, as it were, go anywhere. But it's completely all-pervading. Try to have that feeling. Try to sort of, when you know, it's usually when it goes well, try to sort of take yourself out of the metta, and in a way take others out of the metta, but there's still love. There's still love, even more powerful love, because you've seen through self and other. But then you go a bit further, and this is a teaching of the Buddha, that you then reflect on beauty, because it's said that metta leads to a liberation, a formless liberation called the beautiful. All you have to say is, it is beautiful. It is beautiful. And you enter the liberation called the beautiful, and then everybody and everything is beauty, and you're liberated into that state. So I think that's a good place to close with beauty. I hope you found that helpful, and I hope it will inspire you and help you in your Mettā Bhavana practice. Thank you.